Welcome back to Heiners Workshop Lessons and another episode of Offgrid Auto Electrics. Today we're going to talk about battery chargers and different ways of charging your battery. And since it is one of Andrew's favorite topics in the world, he's here with us.
My favorite topic in the world?
Yeah, I heard that you like battery charging a lot.
I do. Can't deny it.
So I thought it might be a good way for you to share your experience as well.
Okay.
Cool?
Yeah.
For me, there are three different ways, or we use three different ways, how we charge batteries in our setups. One is through AC power. That's usually a generator, the grid, shore power, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And also DC power, which usually comes from an alternator, or solar power or wind power.
Right.
They're the main ones.
Yeah.
There are differences. Not everybody will be able to use all of them.
Yep.
I know you mainly use solar and
DC.
Your normal DC charging.
Yes.
Where you go, AC usually isn't an option.
Even if I'm at a campsite and it has shore power facilities, I don't even plug it in.
No, I'm the same. I usually try to rely on solar for myself.
Yeah.
Which works out really well. With AC power, there's still a big niche for it though, especially with caravans and motorhomes.
Yes.
Because they will have AC power from time to time, but then they won't when they're free camping.
Right.
So with those setups, we usually use AC power in a way that we have got a battery charger which will convert 240 volt to DC power and then charge the batteries, or in a way that we're going to do with your Troopy as well, we will use an inverter that has an inbuilt transfer switch, and through that transfer switch has also got a battery charge. So what you can do with those setups, if you want to, you can explain that as well, if you understood it all the way around.
Well, I'm assuming that the unit runs on 12 volts all the time. If you plug in shore power, some units will automatically convert to direct to AC power.
Yeah.
Okay, but those that do not will still run from the batteries, but the batteries are being charged.
That's right. That's the simple way. I mean, you just get
Yeah.
a normal charger.
Yeah.
Then the inverters with the transfer switches, a bit different, because they
Yeah.
usually got a 240 volt system built into your caravan or motorhome as well.
Yes.
And
Will I have a 2 AC system? I don't really need it, do I? Because the only AC piece of equipment that I'm actually using is the fridge can run on AC as well. But what else am I?
the one main thing.
The inverter, the induction cooker.
Yeah.
Right.
The main thing while we do this.
Okay. If there was a light bulb up there right now, it would have glowed. Ah, okay. That makes complete sense.
So yeah,
now that's an advantage.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And that's when you use that inverter, you've got the inbuilt 240 volt system in your setup.
Yes.
And if you plug in shore power, what will happen is the transfer switch will actually transfer the external shore power to your internal 240 volt system. The inverter will turn off and turn into a battery charger. That's possible with the Victron Multiplus systems, for example.
Right.
So they are the two different AC charging systems that we usually use.
Right.
One very basic.
Yes.
You don't need a 240 volt electrician to install it, because all you do is have a battery charger that you plug into an extension cord, connect it to the batteries.
Which is what I've had all the time up till this point.
Exactly. It's really easy. As long as you don't have to have 240 volt, or you just got an inverter where you directly plug into, then that is the easiest way. As soon as your 240 is a bit more sophisticated, the other option works a lot better.
Right.
By the way, if you want to read a bit more, I've got my little cheat sheet here as well. You can download that, and the link for that is in the description below. There's a few pages, so you can read everything up just in case you don't understand it that quickly. You can download it as well if you want to.
I might.
The next part that I've got on here is, before we get into DC charging, is alternator charging. I find it important to give people an overview of how much power they are actually able to draw from the alternator. Because I think it's perfect to have you here for it as well, because I think you will be struggling as well.
The way we're setting it up now,
Yeah.
that alternator is going to be flat out.
Absolutely. That's what I thought
And it
too.
does worry me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you've got, I've used an example here with the 85 amp alternator and a Hilux, but we might go through your example of a 135 amp alternator.
Yes.
So your alternator will do a maximum of 135 amp,
Yes.
the factory alternator,
Yes.
and we are using 2 DC-DC chargers in that vehicle.
Yes. 30 amp each.
Yeah, but what happens with DC-DC chargers is they will draw in more amperage than they actually put out because the supply voltage is slightly lower on the supply side, and it has to be
lifted on the delivery side.
which means if you get 12 volt in and you want to put out 14 volt at 30 amp, you need to import about 36, 38 amp into the charger itself. So we might be drawing up to 80 amp
just to charge
just for
my
your
auxiliary
chargers.
batteries.
That's right.
Right.
And then you also have to take into consideration in a car, you usually take, depending on the vehicle itself, about 10, 20 amps just to have it running. That's no lights on, nothing. Just have everything running will take about 10, 20 amps.
Yeah.
If you turn your lights on, just your normal car lights, there's usually another 10 amps. If you got spotties, about 15. It depends on how far you go, but I think saying it's about 15 is sort of the average.
And I have quite a nice amplifier.
Music system.
That's 40 plus amps. If maybe
if
even
it's
more.
really cranking.
If it's crank, yeah, it has to crank, but it's the fuse it's a 60 amp fuse.
Yeah, that's right.
So it can deliver. It can use a lot of current.
And then if you crank your fan, your cabin fan, that's usually depends on the fan, 15, 20 amp.
Yeah.
Window wipers are about 10, 15 amp.
Right.
If you put the demister on, which you might not, but if you do, there's another 15 amp roughly.
We're well over. We're well over.
That's right.
Yes.
So these are considerations you have to take when you actually use a DC-DC charger in your setup. You have to make sure you think about, okay, what are my limitations? Because it might still work. You just have to be aware that if you are charging your batteries and it is night and it is raining and it's quite hot, that you will not be able to do everything at the same time.
So what will happen? Now, I think this is now the natural question is, what's going to happen? The DC-DC chargers are going to sense,
Yes.
the good ones anyway,
Yeah.
will sense a lower voltage.
That's
what
right.
will they do?
They will eventually turn off.
Okay. Will they reduce the current until they turn off?
Really good ones, yeah. Victron units will actually, you can set a minimum allowable voltage.
Yeah.
You set them to 12.5 volt.
Right.
And they will not go below. So they keep the vehicle voltage at 12.5 volt. And they'll reduce the charge current to the batteries. So what will happen in your setup, if you use everything at the same time, your battery charging will almost stop.
Will be very low. Okay.
Uh,
But it'll protect the alternator from overheating.
yeah.
Because if it's idling and producing 130 amps of output,
Eventually it's going to get very hot.
do they protect themselves?
No.
They don't protect themselves.
No, really not. I haven't seen one go up in flames yet or overheat, but it can definitely happen. If it's really hot and you load up your alternator to the max at idle, and at idle, an alternator will only do about 60, maybe 70% of its maximum output.
Right.
So you will not be able to get 130 amps out of it when you're idling. It's more like 90 amps that you get from it maximum. And if you then crank everything up, you're true and well over the limit.
Right. Okay. And the one occasion with a troop carrier with a 40 amp DC-DC red arc, we've been camped here a long time. We had a very small solar panel, so it wasn't really coping.
Yeah.
And I ran it for 20 minutes, but I used a fast idle button.
That helps it a lot.
And I was getting 43, 44 amps out of that little 40 amp charger.
And most
it was
cars
really good.
You can even do that, because what you do is when you just idle your car to charge, just turn everything off. You don't need lights. You don't need the fan running, because you're probably not going to sit in the car unless it's really hot and you want to enjoy the aircon at the same time.
Yeah.
But in case you don't do that, then you still got enough energy available. You got about 90 amp that you can take from the alternator. Say you take 10, 15 to run the engine for all the electronics. you got plenty available for your DC-DC charger.
Okay. And how will I know? I'm going to answer my own question. I assume then if the charge current is not sufficient because I'm overloading the alternator, I will just see a poor performance out of my DC-DC charger.
Yes, so if you have your battery monitor, your gauge, where you can see the amps going in and out of the battery, you will see that your engine is running, but you might only get 10, 15 amp into your battery.
That's diagnostics.
And you look at it and go, okay. And then you can check the voltage of your start battery, and you'll see that will be sitting at about 12.5 volts while the engine is running, and it's not coping.
No, it's not coping.
And then you probably press the fast idle up, and you will see that the voltage still stays at 12.5 volts, but the DC-DC chargers ramp up and put more current into the battery.
Maintaining the voltage, so you're sucking current out of the alternator to that voltage.
Yeah. If you use different DC-DC chargers, for example, if you would use, I think, any other one that I know, except for the Victrons, you will see that the DC-DC chargers will turn on and off, on and off, on and off. Because what will happen is the voltage is high enough from the vehicle, and they go, brilliant, we're running.
And they turn on.
They turn on, and they turn on fully.
Voltage drops.
Voltage drops, they go, oh, this is too much. They turn off. The voltage will come back up, and it will start over and over again. And you get a very funny thought where you drive along and you go, you probably look at your volt gauge and you just see that going up and down all the time. And you go like, charging, not charging, charging, not charging. I think in extreme events, if you get it just right, you might even be able to discharge your start battery. And you might arrive somewhere and you want to start again and you can't. Because if the DC-DC charger doesn't turn off quick enough because the settings are set in a way that will still run, and it might run down to 12 volt or something like that, it will take power out of the start battery, and the alternator will not be able to replenish the start battery while you're driving.
Okay, I've not heard of that happening.
I haven't either, but I think in theory that's possible.
In theory, the DC-DC chargers are there to split and protect the start battery.
That is correct.
It's not necessarily happening.
But you know how it's happened when you put a 240 volt charger on your battery?
Oh yes.
And that discharged the battery?
Completely.
Because what happens is the DC-DC chargers will stop charging for a split second, check the voltage, and if it's just right, the alternator will make sure the voltage shoots back up, the DC-DC charger goes, sweet, we're still in the green zone, and will start to charge again, and the voltage will drop again.
So just to clarify, I had my start battery, auxiliary battery, DC-DC charger.
Yeah.
I charged my auxiliary battery, knowing that my my auxiliary battery was quite flat.
Yeah.
So it charged at 10 amps. It charged my AC charger was a 10 amp charger. The DC-DC charger was a 25 amp charger or 40 amp charger.
Yeah.
Okay. So it sucked 40 amps straight out of the start battery until the start battery was completely flat, because the 10 amp AC charger couldn't cope. It was losing 20 plus amps every hour, and when I got to the car, wouldn't start. Start battery, even though I was charging the start battery was completely flat, stone dead.
Because the reason for that is that a DC-DC charger will stop every minute for about a second, and it will check the voltage of the start battery. And to be able to check that voltage properly, it stops charging so that it gets rid of the voltage drop on the cable. Because a lot of times DC-DC chargers were installed with cables that had a volt or 1.5 voltage drop on it, but the manufacturer doesn't want that to affect the charging of the unit itself. So what they do is they overcome the voltage drop throughout the charge cycle, but make sure every minute to check what the start battery voltage is like.
How's it doing? Yes.
You know, and that is just what happens with your 10 amp charger. When it stops, the voltage shoots back up, it checks, we're still good to go, and it draws it further down.
Okay.
And that can happen with the alternator too. You have to be in that right sweet spot.
So that's what you're saying, it can happen with an alternator as well, really, is what you're saying.
You just have to be, everything has to be aligned for it to happen in the right way, if you know what I mean. But it is theoretically possible. So it's another reason why you should check how much current you will actually have available from your alternator and not dramatically go over. Or if you do, at least be aware of that you can't run certain things at the same time.
Yeah.
You might have to say, hey, if it is a day where it's night, it's raining, it's humid, I need my aircon, I need my window wipers, I need my lights, pull the fuse for the DC-DC out. That might be the solution for it. You just have to know your system well enough so you know of the shortcomings and how to get around them. That can help.
Okay, good.
It is on this sheet in a lot shorter, and there's also some examples for how many amps certain things will draw, so you get a rough idea and you can do the calculations yourself at home if you want to. I think we already touched on most of the stuff for the DC-DC chargers as well. I think we did bring across how a DC-DC charger is able to use the right charge profile and up the voltage. That is the main thing that a DC-DC charger does. Yes. Instead of running directly off your alternator, it might actually make sense to talk a bit more about this. If you charge directly off your alternator and you start your deep cycle, you charge your deep cycle battery off the alternator, you will not get enough voltage at the battery, which will lead to, if you're lucky, an 80% charge battery. If you've got an old style alternator, if you got a temperature compensating alternator, which will sit at 13.2 volt after about half an hour of driving, or even worse, a smart alternator, you might be lucky if you get 50% charge.
Right.
Tops. Which I think you have experienced in Africa.
Oh, I've driven me crazy.
Yeah.
And this is because the split charge system was a solenoid based.
Yes, that's right.
And I actually counted there were 9 connections, 9 separate connections, because whenever you have a connection, that's the point where you get the largest voltage drop.
Yeah.
And each connection was quite a good one.
Yeah.
There were 9 of them. By the time it actually got to the battery after day 2 of constant driving, the fridge would not run unless the engine was running because the voltage was so low.
Yeah.
The current going to the battery just wasn't charging. It was probably charging of an entire day's driving. It was probably getting not even 1/10 of its capacity during an entire day's driving, purely because of the voltage drop along the line. And it had been wired badly. So I actually ran a separate earth. They'd used the body earth.
Yeah.
Which was a problem again. I saw that. They'd used the earth as the body. And I got some wire and I ran a cable from the battery earth directly to the fridge earth. Made a big difference. It still wasn't good, but it made a big difference because I could see that all the positive was switched, 9 different connections, and body earth. That's not the way to do it.
And probably a terrible one as well.
And probably a terrible one. So I ran this and it made a big difference. And eventually actually just got rid of those 9 connections and just ran a cable. I rigged up a quick fuse next to the battery and I ran a cable straight to the fridge.
Yeah.
And we actually had a fridge that was working reasonably well.
Cool.
So, but it was a product that was sold on the market that people were fitting. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And it made me cross because these products were being sold.
Yeah. And a DC-DC charger would have overcome that problem.
Completely.
A DC-DC charger, what it does, it will take the low input voltage and you set a certain battery chemistry in the DC-DC charger. You tell it if you want to charge an AGM battery or gel battery or standard lead acid battery or lithium battery. And then it will run a certain charge profile and make sure the battery gets the right final voltage. So it charges up to almost 100%. I think lithium probably does charge to 100%. AGM you will get about 95, 98%. It's still a lot better. And from that, overcome of the voltage drop, that is where you get proper performance from your battery. So that is one of the main things you want to run.
To me, DC-DC is the biggest game changer in 12-volt battery technology in my lifetime.
Okay.
It's
you've told me that
changed
before.
everything. Because we used to start with AGMs, or even before AGMs, standard kind of the deep cycle batteries, and control systems to split charged, and they never worked, and the batteries didn't get a proper charge, and you limped along and tried to make the best of them.
Yeah.
And then I was offered a C-Tech, I think was one of the very first people to come up. It was a 10 amp DC-DC, and the agent contacted me, and I was about to go on a trip, and he said to me, I've got this new thing, it's revolutionized, will you fit it? I fitted it myself. It took that evening, it was before a trip, it was the evening before a trip. And I had reduced it down to a switch under my bonnet.
Okay.
So I park at the campsite, open the bonnet, turn off the start battery. And that worked. It actually worked.
Yeah.
It worked. Because I had this one cable with one switch, and that was it.
Yeah.
Going to my auxiliary battery, low voltage drop. And he gave me this thing, and I plugged it in, and I remember actually leaving in the morning knowing that my battery was almost completely flat. I ran the fridge on purpose. I ran everything in the car all night. I think there were 2 fridges. There was a console fridge as well, I seem to remember, but I remember the battery was really, really flat, and I drove for 1 hour, stopped the car, turned the engine off, and then measured the voltage. And it was sitting at 12.9 volts static with no load, and I thought, hang on a minute, let's put a load on. So I put a load on, and it dropped, to 12.5 with the fridges still running after 1 hour driving.
That's pretty
with
good.
a flat battery.
Yeah.
Whereas the old system, it would have meant an entire day I wouldn't have got that.
Yeah.
So that was wow. Never looked back.
Yeah. That is the big change for that. There's also another reason we use DC-DC chargers with lithium batteries, because you could charge a lithium battery directly off an alternator. If you've got an alternator that puts out 14.2 volt, you can use that and you can charge your lithium battery, and as soon as it's full, you could just cut the power supply from the alternator and the battery would be full. That would work.
Right.
But for those systems, you will actually have to limit the input current, because the lithium battery will take whatever it can get. A 100 amp hour lithium battery would probably happily take 150 amp in. The BMS would probably shut it down, but it would almost act like a dead short, and it will cook the alternator. It will completely overload the alternator.
Okay.
Even a big alternator will most likely get overloaded.
Okay.
So we use DC-DC chargers as a current limiting device, because lithium batteries will also have a specified maximum charge current. If you stick to that, they will actually live a long, happy life. If you go over that, it shortens the lifespan. So for lithium batteries, DC-DC chargers are really just current limiting devices, because you do usually not need anything more than that. Yeah. That's a different way of using it, but it also works really well. But it is quite different for what you would use it for with AGM batteries. But
it's amazing, you can put an AGM at another part of the vehicle where the voltage drop is actually quite severe from the auxiliary battery and the alternator, quite a long way to the battery that's now being charged, and a DC will handle that voltage drop.
It will.
And make up for it.
Yeah, caravans, same thing.
Same thing, yes.
Because you got, all the back to the end of the car, then you got a plug, and then you got another 5-6 meters before you where the battery is. And it's really important with DC-DC chargers, put the DC-DC charger right next to the battery that you do want to charge. It can be far away from the battery where you get the power from. It will compensate for that voltage drop, but put it next to the battery that you want to charge, because that can't be compensated.
So that voltage from the DC-DC to the battery being charged should be a simple short.
Yes, because you want to limit voltage drop there, because that cannot be compensated for. That's probably it about DC-DC charging. The next big one is solar/wind charging. I focused mainly on solar charging. It is very similar to how you would use a wind turbine.
Yes.
You use MPPT regulators for that as well.
Yes.
They might be a bit different. I've never tried that. But I want to focus on the solar side of things, because that's what we do. And it is easier to mount solar panels on something than it is to actually...
Can we talk about mounting solar panels on the roof of cars and caravans and vans and four-wheel drives?
Yeah.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah.
Can I share my thoughts?
Yeah.
Do you have a small solar panel we can use as a prop?
Cool.
Thank you. So, these are my thoughts. You can tell me if I'm talking nonsense or not.
Go for it.
Okay. When you're camped, you're going to be camped if you're lucky, under shade. So it's bolted onto the car.
Yeah.
You're getting shade, so you're not getting a good amount of charge. Particularly with the kind of panels that where if you just cover a very small portion of the panel, it virtually dies.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so you have to get the whole thing in the sun.
Yeah.
So if it's bolted onto your vehicle, be prepared to park in the sun.
You have to, yeah.
Okay, so now I'm parked in the sun, and I've got one of these beautiful true carriers. You've seen them with those beautiful the roof that lifts up, and inside you know.
I know, and it's quite steep when it's lifted up.
Don't put the solar panel on the roof.
No, the only reason you would put a solar panel on the...
I'll get there.
I
know what he's about to say. So it's now on a roof. I've seen them, vehicles with a rooftop tent, and they put a solar panel in the front leaning like this.
Yeah, and north is probably that direction.
Well, if you're parked and you're facing north, you'll be okay. But if you're facing northwest, you're not okay for almost all of the day, so you'll only get the afternoon sun. And if you're parked south, 0, because the sun's doing this and your panel's like this. No, you'll get virtually nothing, even if the car's in the sun.
Yeah, I mean, you get a little tiny bit, but it is
really
10% of what
it's
you could
so
do.
little.
Yeah.
So what do? You put it flat, because it doesn't matter which way you parked.
Correct.
You'll still get a reasonable amount of current,
yeah.
no matter which way you're parked.
Yeah. And you don't have to worry about how you park and where you park.
You just park and get the car nice and level, and you'll get a reasonably good charge.
Yeah.
The moment you tilt it, that efficiency, unless you're parked perfectly, goes out.
If you tilt it, you have to go perfectly north, almost perfectly
and then
north.
And normally we park because of the wind. You say, okay, which way are we going to need a bit of wind buffer or whatever like that? So we don't think about
or where the view is.
Or where the view is.
Or where it's level and you can get the car.
What you were about to say was, what's nice about it, if you've got the vehicle is parked up and you're going on a canoe trip or you're going on.
Yeah, you leave the vehicle for a few days somewhere.
It'll keep your fridge running.
That's it. And you don't. The only reason we usually put solar panels on roofs is just to make sure that the fridge can keep running when the vehicle is parked up somewhere for a longer period of time. So you don't have to throw away all your groceries in the fridge, then go on a trip and come back a few days later and go shopping again.
Yeah.
Or if you want to have a constantly running fridge because you like cold beer around town as well.
So you've said to me, why aren't I going to put one in mine for that purpose? We're talking about a 400 amp hour battery capacity, which is how many kilowatt hours? You worked it out?
5 kilowatt hours.
How many days can I sit there with my fridge running flat out?
Probably 2 weeks.
Exactly. I don't need it.
No, you probably don't. With a battery bank like that, you probably don't.
No, I don't. But that's a consideration to me of whether you put a solar panel. Blankets,
totally.
Solar blankets.
Blankets are brilliant. And that is,
so
before we talk about all of that, I'm going to touch more on that in the next episode because that will be purely about solar. It will just be solar, how to mount and how to get the most out of it.
Okay.
The important thing...
Lift a bit, there you go, perfect.
Oh yeah, it's that time of the day. The PWM regulator, how that works is, it will actually turn your solar panel on and off really quickly. Let's say you've got a 24 volt solar panel and you want to charge a battery at 12 volt. What it will do is it will turn about 1,000 times a second, will it turn your solar panel on and off to actually create 12 volt, which means the PWM regulator in that situation will only be 50% efficient. That's why PWM regulators can be really terrible. So if you had a 48 volt solar panel and you wanted to charge a 12 volt battery, it will only be 25% efficient. But if you have got a 15 volt solar panel and you want to charge a battery up to 14 volt, then it will be relatively efficient. So if you want to use a PWM regulator, they're not all terrible all the time. You just have to make sure that your solar panel voltage is very close to your battery voltage.
Oh, okay.
And then it will actually work quite well.
And cut. Go.
MPPT regulators are very different because they can change from a certain input voltage and input amperage to a different output voltage and output amperage. So if you want to run a 48 volt panel that might do 5 amp, you can then have 12 volt output with 20 amp. That is the beauty of that. And it will do it at an efficiency of about 95 to 98%. Somewhere really, really efficient, which makes a lot of sense. There's a good example where we use a lot of MPPT regulators. That is when we convert caravan roof solar systems. I put an example on the sheet here that you can have a look through. Let's say you've got a caravan that's already got 200 watt panels on the roof. They're running in parallel, so you get about 12 volt from them. They are running on 18 volt to a regulator, and they produce about 5.5 amp each. That's about roughly 100 watt. So what you get on your regulator is 18 volt and 11 amp. Make sense?
Right.
The two panels?
Yes.
If you now want to upgrade your roof solar and you want to add another 2 100 watt panels to it, you usually only got a small cable running to the roof that you can't replace, because once the caravan is built, it's built, and you can't run more cables, or it will be very hard to actually run cables to the roof again. So what you can do is you use an MPPT regulator, and instead of putting the panels all in parallel, you will now put the panels in series. You use 2 of them in series, and you create a string of 2 panels. And in parallel to that, you use another 2 panels in series. So you run 2 strings, which means that now you up your solar panel voltage to 36 volts, but you still only get 11 amp. That way you still get away with the smaller cable. But where your MPPT regulator is, it uses the 36 amps, reduces it to the voltage that you want to charge your batteries at, and up the amperage again. That is the beauty of the MPPT regulators. That's what we use them for most of the time. Another good thing about the higher voltage of the solar panels is also that you will start charging earlier in the day, and
Yes.
you stop charging later in the day.
Because the MPPT controller turns off and on according to the input voltage from the solar panel.
That's right.
So if the voltage is higher for later, it'll run for longer.
Yeah. The only thing you have to be aware of with using MPPTs, the voltage of the solar panel has to be higher than the voltage of the battery. An MPPT cannot use a lower input voltage and create a higher output voltage.
Okay.
So it works the opposite way around from a DC-DC charger.
Yeah.
And depending on the manufacturer, that gap, that voltage gap, might be smaller or bigger. The lowest one I think I know is about 1 volt. The biggest one that I know is about 5 volt.
Okay.
But it will vary from manufacturer to manufacturer.
Excellent.
I think that covered it. That's all the chargers that we usually use in a setup somewhere. Cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. And as per usual, and what do we say to people? Like
If you liked it, what have you got to lose? And subscribe.
Yeah.
What have you got to lose?
Exactly. Thank you for watching. See you next time. And in the next episode, we're going to talk a bit more about how to use your solar system and how to get the best out of your solar system. Thank you for coming in, Andrew.
Pleasure.
It was a pleasure. It's a lot easier with you here. There's a lot more to talk about.
Good. Anytime.
Brilliant. Thank you for your input.
Thank you.
What if you phone me 3 times a day? What if you phone me 3 times a day?